The vast expanses of space have always seemed to Grayson Westbrook something majestic and mysterious, but at the same time infinitely lonely. As a pilot with many years of experience, he is used to this feeling. The stars twinkling in the distance never seemed friendly or inviting to him. It was a void in which a person was devoid of any importance, just another point among millions of luminaries. Grayson stood at the observation window on board the Stellar Dawn, a large spacecraft designed for long interstellar flights. The interior of the ship surrounding him was sterile and cold, made in silver and gray tones, as if symbolizing life on the ship, monotonous, devoid of any living colors. The flight to the planet Lunaria did not promise Grayson anything new, just another assignment, another contract. His mind wandered among the countless files with technical specifications and the route he had to take. Another day, another flight, everything was predictable and nothing promised to change. But something felt different this time. Perhaps it was a premonition of something unusual, something that he could not yet comprehend. At some point, Grayson felt a little dizzy. Spaceflight, although familiar to him, still did not spare his physical condition. He decided to head to the infirmary, a place he had only visited a couple of times before. It was a long way from his favorite part of the ship, the technical center, where he could sit for hours looking through the ship's systems, lost in his thoughts. The sick bay was in another wing of the ship, and on the way there, Grayson walked through long, almost empty corridors. Only the measured noise of the engines and the occasional footsteps of other passengers broke the silence. The journey seemed endless, and Grayson enjoyed the solitude, thinking about his future on the moon and how long he would have to stay on this planet. As soon as he reached the infirmary, he froze at the threshold. Instead of the usual metal surfaces, silence reigned here, which was diluted only by the dim light of white and blue lamps. The sick bay was not just a functional space. It was created to calm down, so that passengers could relax during long flights. Grayson looked around the room, and at that moment, he saw her, Elani. She was standing at one of the medical tables, her back to him, her figure shrouded in the soft light that emanated from the medical equipment. Unlike humans, her skin was smooth, almost shiny, with a slight silvery tinge. She was an alien from the planet Lyrax. It was obvious from her characteristic features. Long, slightly pointed ears and eyes that shone with bright light. Grayson froze for a second. He didn't know why her presence had so suddenly startled him. Perhaps it was her grace or that unusual, almost ethereal aura that surrounded her. Everything he saw was beyond his normal perception. It was something new, and this new thing turned out to be so strong that it made him feel like a stranger in this moment. Elani turned, her movements fast, but at the same time calm and gentle. When their gazes met, time seemed to stop. Her eyes, huge, luminous, looked at him with interest but without fear. It was curiosity mixed with a touch of caution, as if she had met someone whose presence boded neither good nor evil but promised something unpredictable. They stood opposite each other for several seconds without saying a word. It was a strange moment filled with silence that spoke more than any words. Grayson didn't know what to say, and he didn't seem to know how to behave. Everything that was happening seemed to him like some kind of dream out of place in his routine life. Elani was the first to break the silence. She took a step forward, her face still neutral, but the beginnings of a smile could be read in her eyes. Grayson felt his heart begin to beat a little faster, but he didn't know why. He took one step forward, as if to break the silence that had arisen. At that moment, he noticed that her hands were occupied with a medical device, and it finally brought him back to reality. He forgot about the reason for his visit here and quickly glanced at the instruments. But Elani, noticing his attention, gently placed the device on the table and motioned for him to come over. She was a nurse. It became clear from her actions and the confidence with which she moved in the medical bay. Grayson stepped closer, feeling a strange feeling building inside him. It's not that he wasn't familiar with aliens. Space has long been home to representatives of many civilizations. But there was something special about Elani, something he couldn't explain. It was like a magnetic attraction that defied any logical explanation. When he was next to her, she calmly touched his arm, checking his pulse. Her touch was cool, but that didn't make it unpleasant. On the contrary, it was something soothing, as if her very presence was created to bring. They spent several minutes in silence. Elani examined him with professional care, and Grayson couldn't help but notice how her slender fingers deftly handled the medical devices. Everything she did was confident, calm, as if she had been working in this field, but something in her gaze suggested that she wasn't just a nurse. Her eyes glittered not only from the light, but also from hidden emotions. Perhaps from interest in him as a person, perhaps from something else. She was an alien, and Grayson knew that her culture was probably different from his own. But at that moment, these differences didn't matter. When Elani finished her examination, she nodded slightly, making it clear that everything was fine. But her gaze lingered on him longer than was necessary for simple medical communication. Grayson felt a slight thrill, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. They stood opposite each other, and the silence fell over them again. But this time it was softer, less tense. Elani took a step back, her eyes meeting his once more. That look was short, but there was something deeper in it than just professional concern. She turned around and headed for the exit of the infirmary, leaving him standing there alone. Grayson didn't move for a few more minutes, thinking about what had just happened. It was a strange feeling, as if he was caught up in an event that he did not fully understand. But one thing he knew for sure, his world had just changed. When he returned to his business, everything seemed different. He couldn't get her image out of his head. Those brief moments of silence and the rare glances they exchanged left an indelible mark. And at that moment, he understood it wasn't just a meeting. It was the beginning of something bigger. Since their first encounter in the sickbay aboard the Stellar Dawn spacecraft, Grayson couldn't stop thinking about her, about a mysterious alien named Elani, whose silence proved to be more expressive to him than any words. Their brief encounter left him brooding, as if something deep and unexplored had crept into his mind and forced him to look for answers where he had not found anything interesting before. It's been a few days since they first met. Life on the ship went on as usual. Everything was still monotonous and devoid of any surprises. Grayson performed his duties as a pilot and technical specialist, checking the ship's systems, monitoring the course, and maintaining contact with the command. But every time he walked through the corridors of the ship, his gaze unconsciously lingered on the doors of the sickbay. He felt that their meeting was not accidental, but he could not understand why. An irresistible desire to see her again was growing inside him. He wondered who she really was, why her presence on the ship had hooked him so much. He didn't know how to approach her because their communication was silent, and her alien origin added an additional barrier. But something drew him to Elani, as if they were connected by an invisible thread that he could neither see nor understand yet. On one of the usual days, as the ship continued its flight through the cold expanses of space, Grayson again decided to pass by the sickbay. He walked slowly, trying to appear indifferent, although a sense of expectation was growing in his heart. He hoped to see her again, and maybe find a way to strike up a conversation this time. As he approached the doors, they suddenly opened, and Elani appeared in front of him again. This time she was not immersed in work as she had been when they first met. She stood as if she had been waiting for him for a long time. Her silvery eyes met his gaze, and in that gaze he caught something more than just professional interest. She was here for a reason. Their eyes met, and for a moment time stood still. Elani was still calm. Her movements were smooth, but there was a certain hidden tension in the air around her, as if she expected Grayson to speak first. But he couldn't. The words stuck in his throat, and silence enveloped them again, as it had been at their first meeting. They stood opposite each other, not knowing how to start a conversation. Silence filled the space, and this silence seemed to be filled with meaning. Elani took a small step forward. Her figure seemed almost unreal against the background of the cold metal walls of the ship. Grayson felt a slight tremor run through his body, but he didn't move. He didn't want to ruin this moment. Soon, Elani tilted her head slightly. Her eyes shone brighter, and she motioned for him to go to the infirmary. Her movements were gentle but determined, as if she knew he would accept her invitation. Grayson hesitated only for a moment and then followed her, entering a room that now seemed more familiar to him, but at the same time filled with a new mystery. When the door closed behind them, the air in the room became dense again. Elani wasn't looking at him directly, but her presence was palpable. She began to adjust something on one of the medical devices, her long fingers moving with precision and confidence. Grayson watched her work, watching her graceful movements, and it seemed to him that he was seeing not just a professional, but a being who understood much more than words could convey. They spent several minutes in this silent interaction. Her touch on the devices seemed natural, almost intuitive, as if she was born to heal and heal. At some point, when her fingers slid over the panel, the device glowed with a bright light reflecting her face, and a slight shadow of a smile flickered on her lips. It was the first expression of emotion he had seen on her face, and it struck him as sincere. Then Elani turned to him. There was no longer the same detachment in her gaze. She was looking straight into his eyes, and Grayson felt something change inside him. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a feeling that there was an invisible connection between them that was just beginning to manifest itself. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and froze again, not knowing what to say. But this time, the silence did not weigh on them as before. They were standing close to each other, and there was something inexplicable in the air and attraction that could not be ignored. Elani took another step, her eyes shining like stars in the night, and Grayson felt her hand lightly touch his arm. The touch was soft and cool, but at the same time it filled his body with a wave of warmth. They stood without saying a word, but every gesture, every movement conveyed much more than any dialogue could express. Their gazes were frozen, as if at that moment they were plunging into the infinity that united their worlds. Elani returned to her medical devices, but her presence next to him was no longer neutral. She clearly sensed his interest, just as he sensed hers. Their communication was quiet and unobtrusive, but with each new moment, something more intensified between them. A subtle attraction that grew stronger every moment. After a short pause, Grayson slowly headed for the exit. At the last moment before leaving the sick bay, he turned around. Elani stood looking after him, her figure illuminated by the soft glow of the instruments. She didn't move, but her eyes followed him as if she was waiting for him to come back. It was a quiet challenge that required no words, and Grayson knew he would return. The next few days were a real challenge for him. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Every time he passed the infirmary, his steps slowed down, and he involuntarily looked at the door behind which Elani was hiding. He didn't know how to explain this strange attraction he felt for her. Maybe it was her alien nature, or maybe it was her silent self-confidence that made her mysterious and unattainable. After a while, Grayson decided to go to the infirmary again. His heart was beating faster when the doors opened in front of him again. Inside, everything was the same as last time. Soft lights, muffled sounds of appliances, and the quiet, barely noticeable presence of Elani. She was standing at one of the medical tables again, her face focused, but at the same time, peaceful. Grayson came closer, and this time he felt the tension between them increase. They didn't talk again, but the silence was no longer awkward. It was a silence in which both understood each other without words. Elani touched his hand again, as if checking his condition, but her gesture concealed the same gentleness as the last time. Her fingers slid over his wrist, and Grayson suddenly felt an electric spark run between them. It was a light touch, but it filled his whole mind. He couldn't focus on anything else. They stood side by side, their eyes met again. Grayson took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. At that moment, he realized that he could no longer ignore his feelings. Elani wasn't just a nurse. She became more than a mystery to him that he wanted to solve. He ran his hand over her arm, and this time she didn't pull away. Their silent communication continued, but now their every gesture indicated that their attraction had become too strong to ignore. At that moment, something more than just interest flared up between them. It all started from the moment Grayson realized that his thoughts inevitably returned to her. Everything in his life that had seemed simple and predictable before was now overshadowed by the presence of something new, something he couldn't ignore. This attraction to Elani, an alien from Lyrax, grew stronger every day. It was not a passion that flared up instantly. Rather, it was a deep feeling slowly accumulating inside, like a fire fanned by a light breeze that gradually turns into a... After several meetings in the infirmary, their interaction became something more than just casual contacts. Grayson increasingly found excuses to drop by where Elani worked. Her calm, almost silent presence made him feel different, more vulnerable, but at the same time more alive than ever. Their every gesture, every look began to take on a new meaning, even if they did not exchange words. Now, when he entered the infirmary, his heart began to beat faster. Her presence was felt even before he saw her. He felt it as an invisible wave of energy that permeated the entire space around them. Elani never did anything unnecessary. Her movements were always as soft as a breeze, her eyes following him with the same detached but warm concern that he had felt since their first meeting. But now there was something new in her every look, in every touch, something that was more than just professional. One day when Grayson came back to the infirmary under the pretext of checking the equipment, Elani met his gaze with such genuine warmth that he couldn't ignore it. She didn't say anything, as she always did, but her presence became even more pronounced for him. In the silence that enveloped them, he began to feel something inexplicable growing between them. There was an unusual silence on board the ship that evening. The passengers had long since gone to their cabins, and only the sick bay remained brightly lit. When Grayson entered there, he was enveloped in his usual calm, but this time that calm was imbued with a sense of intimacy. Elani was standing at her workplace, doing her usual things, but when she heard his footsteps, she turned her head and met his gaze. Her eyes, those luminous, starry eyes that had so mesmerized him from the first meeting, looked at him with such depth that he felt a wave of warmth run through his body. They were alone again. There was no room for accidents in the silence that filled the sick bay. Elani moved slowly, her fingers touching the instruments, but Grayson could see that she felt his presence as much as he felt hers. He felt that this was the moment when everything changed. It was like the first light wind that foreshadowed a storm, and he wasn't ready to stop him. Grayson took a few steps forward, his breathing getting heavier. He didn't know what to say and wasn't sure if words were necessary. There was enough silence between them to express everything they both felt. He came closer, and when there were only a few steps between them, Elani finally looked away, returning to her work. But her movements became slower, as if she was waiting for his actions. He stood beside her, his gaze following her every move. At one point, she stopped. Her fingers hovered over the device, and then she turned back to him. Their eyes met, and this time the silence between them was different. It wasn't just a lack of words. It was a tense silence full of energy that could explode at any moment. Elani cautiously reached out to him, her fingers barely touching his arm. The touch was so light that Grayson barely felt it, but at the same time, it was a moment when something in him changed. Her touch was cool, but it caused an indescribable warmth. He slowly raised his hand in response to her gesture, and their fingers intertwined. It wasn't just a touch. It was an admission that there really was something between them. Slowly, without unnecessary movements, Grayson took another step forward. His hand gently slid along her arm, and then he gently touched her face. Elani didn't pull away. Her eyes were fixed on him, and at that moment he felt that she was ready to accept everything that was happening between them. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was more than passion. It was the realization that something deep and important had arisen between them. They stood like that for a few seconds. Their breathing became synchronized. Grayson could feel her skin smooth and cool under his fingers, but at the same time, her presence caused a heat in him that spread throughout his body. Her eyes, those bottomless, luminous eyes, stared at him with such force that he couldn't take his eyes off her. It was a moment in which his whole being was focused only on her. Suddenly, Elani tilted her head slightly, and her breath touched his skin. Grayson felt his heart beat faster, and at that moment he realized he couldn't stop. He slowly leaned closer, and their faces were so close that he could feel her warmth, her breath. He froze for a moment, giving her the opportunity to pull away if she wanted to. But she didn't pull away. Their lips met in a quiet, almost weightless kiss that seemed so natural, as if they had been waiting for this moment all their lives. There was more tenderness than passion in this kiss, but this tenderness was much stronger than any physical intimacy. Grayson felt their bodies merge in that brief moment, and everything around them ceased to exist. They pulled away from each other, but their hands were still intertwined. The room was quiet, except for their breathing. Elani looked at him, her eyes glittering from the light of the instruments. But there was something new in them now, something that he could not fully understand but felt with all his being. After that, everything began to change. Their meetings in the infirmary were no longer random. Every time they were alone, a fire flared up between them, which they both tried to keep under control, but it burst out more and more. Every touch, every look, every gesture became imbued with this hidden feeling that was too strong. One evening, when they were alone again, Grayson felt her fingers slide over his arm again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He pulled her closer to him. Their bodies touched, and he felt her warmth. At that moment, he realized that he couldn't stop. They both knew it wasn't just an affair. It was something that would change their lives forever. This closeness became their shared secret, which they kept from the others on board. And every moment they spent together was even more valuable to them because they knew that their bond went beyond mere physical attraction. After the first spark broke out between Grayson and Elani, their lives aboard Stellar Dawn changed forever. They could no longer ignore the attraction that was getting stronger every day. It all started with brief moments of intimacy in the infirmary, but soon these meetings became permanent, hidden from prying eyes. Their romance, like a mysterious flame, burned only for the two of them, and every day was soaked with adrenaline and a sense of elusive danger. Life on the ship was not conducive to romance. Stellar Dawn was a huge metal machine in which everything was built on clear rules, routine tasks, and impersonal spaces. There was no room inside the ship for anything personal, for anything intimate. In this spaceship, everyone was part of a large mechanism, and every individual seemed to be drowned in cold and steel corridors. But it was in these circumstances that their romance became a real escape from reality. Every time Grayson and Elani crossed paths in the corridors of the ship, their eyes met only for a moment, but this short moment was full of meaning for them. It was their secret communication, invisible to others. They did not speak, did not touch each other publicly, but they knew that once they were alone, this silent connection would return again, like a quiet melody playing only for them. Grayson spent his days doing his usual duties on the ship, but his thoughts kept returning to Elani. He thought about her in the engineering when he checked the condition of the engines, and in the cabin when he was alone. Everything reminded him of her, the emptiness of space beyond the porthole, the silence of the long corridors where their footsteps sometimes accidentally crossed. Even the air aboard Stellar Dawn seemed different to him when he knew that she was somewhere on this ship and that their connection existed despite all the barriers. This relationship, which at first was just a flash of attraction, now became something important to him, something that gave him the strength to continue living in this endless loneliness of space. Elani was more to him than just a nurse or an alien. She became his refuge in this cold and empty world. They met every time they found an opportunity to be alone. These meetings were brief, but filled with an intensity that consumed them both. Sometimes these were night visits to the sick bay, when the ship was immersed in silence, and only the occasional footsteps of the crew disturbed this peace. Grayson quietly made his way through the corridors, trying to avoid prying eyes, and each time his heart beat faster when he approached the doors of the sick bay, knowing that Elani was waiting inside. When the doors opened and he went inside, the world around him became different. They were no longer a pilot and a nurse. They were just two beings who had found each other in this endless cosmos. Every time they were alone, their closeness became even more palpable, like an invisible force that seized them and did not let them escape. Elani was quiet, but her presence spoke for her. She never uttered unnecessary words, but her every gesture, every movement was filled with meaning. She stood next to him, her hands gently touching his shoulders, her fingers gently sliding over his skin, and that was enough to rekindle the flame that had been burning since the first day. Their look said more than any words. They looked at each other with an understanding that required no explanation. Every meeting was imbued with a sense of danger. They knew that if their relationship was exposed, it could lead to serious consequences. Grayson couldn't afford to jeopardize his career, and Elani understood that her status aboard the ship was already fragile enough, but this risk only fueled their feelings. The more they hid their relationship, the stronger the attraction between them became. They began to find more and more secluded places for their meetings. The sick bay became too obvious a place, and they moved to forgotten corners of the ship where the crew rarely went. In the dark corridors, where only the flickering of emergency lights illuminated their path, they found brief moments of intimacy. They hid in technical rooms, in warehouses with equipment, even in the old holds of the ship, which had long been abandoned. These places became their hiding places, where they could be together, hidden from the whole world. Every touch, every kiss in these secluded places seemed forbidden. But that was what made their relationship even more exciting. At such moments, the whole world disappeared for them, and only the two of them remained. Grayson felt his heart fill not only with passion, but also with something more, something that was deeper than simple attraction. Sometimes they spent nights in the technical rooms of the ship, hiding from prying eyes. Grayson lay down next to Elani, feeling her warmth next to him, and it filled him with a calmness that he could not find anywhere else. He touched her skin smooth and cool, and it reminded him of how different she was from him. But these differences only intensified his feelings. He knew she wasn't like humans, but it didn't matter. She was his, and that was the main thing. Elani also felt this connection. She didn't need words to express her feelings. Every time they were alone, her movements became softer, her touch more confident. She understood that there was more than just a physical attraction between them. It was a connection they couldn't ignore. But with each new meeting, it became more and more difficult to hide their relationship. The crew of Stellar Dawn was small, and even small changes in the behavior of Grayson or Elani could arouse suspicion. They increasingly felt like they were being watched. Once, when they met in the dark corridor near the engine room, Grayson heard footsteps. He froze, and Elani stopped next to him, listening to the noise. The footsteps stopped, but it was a warning. They knew that their secret could be revealed at any moment. Despite this fear, they couldn't stop. Secret meetings became the reason for their existence on board the ship. It was like a drug. The more they hid their relationship, the stronger their desire to be together became. Every time they took a risk, it only increased their feeling. They knew that time aboard Stellar Dawn was limited. When the ship reached its final destination, the planet Lunaria, their paths could part forever. Grayson knew he couldn't stay on this planet without Elani, and these thoughts worried him more and more. Their relationship was becoming something vital to him, and he couldn't imagine his life without her. With each new meeting, he thought more and more about what would happen next. They couldn't hide on board the ship forever. One day, their relationship will be revealed, and then they will have to make serious decisions. But for now, they lived in this secret world, in this secluded corner of the universe, where only the two of them mattered. Grayson knew that their relationship was more than just a secret affair. She became the meaning of life for him, the thing that gave him the strength to move on. And despite all the dangers that surrounded them, he was ready to go to the end to keep this feeling. Time on board Stellar Dawn moved inexorably forward, and each new day brought the ship closer to its final destination, the planet Lunaria. But every day one thought loomed more clearly in Grayson's mind. His place was not on Lunaria, not on this ship, but next to Elani. Their secret romance on board, which was not only a salvation for them, but also a hidden oasis in this cold, impersonal space, turned into something much more. This relationship could no longer be called just a short adventure. Grayson knew that a future with Elani was the only path he was willing to take. As the ship approached Lunaria, their meetings became increasingly tense. Every time they found themselves alone, somewhere in the dark corners of the ship, it was like a desperate attempt to grab onto those moments that slipped away like sand through your fingers. Grayson felt that their secret world, built on stealing time and hidden kisses, could soon collapse. The moon was the destination for everyone on board, but for them it was not the end goal, but perhaps the beginning of a new chapter or the end of the whole story. These days were a real test for Grayson. His mind was now spinning not only with thoughts about how to hide their relationship, but also what would happen next. He couldn't just stay on Lunaria fulfilling a contract when his heart was now with Elani. Every time he saw her, touched her hand, felt her breath next to him, he realized that he could no longer live without her. But along with this came the realization that their future is not on this distant planet, but on Earth. Returning to Earth became a plan for him, which gradually loomed in his head. There, on his home planet, they could start a new life away from all this. From the strict rules of the ship, from the constant fear of being discovered, from the tension that hung over them like a heavy cloud. They could find a quiet corner where no one would know about them, where they could finally be together openly, without hiding in the shadows. Grayson began to think about how he could suggest that Elani leave Lunaria and go with him to Earth. He understood that her situation was difficult. She was an alien from Lyrax, and her mission on Stellar Dawn was important. But he also knew that their feelings were stronger than any logic or duty. Everything became clear in his mind. He had to offer her this opportunity. Go back with him. Start a new life. One day, when they met again in one of their secluded corners of the ship, in an abandoned compartment where no one had appeared for a long time, Grayson stood next to Elani, feeling her quiet presence. He looked at her and at that moment realized that he couldn't wait any longer. Their entire future depended on the decision they had to make together. He slowly ran his hand over her shoulder, and his thoughts revolved around one thing: how to tell her that he wanted to bring her back to Earth, that he couldn't do without her, that he was ready to give up everything for this new life. Over the next few days, he continued to ponder this. His thoughts became clearer and clearer, and eventually he realized that there was no point in dragging it out. He began preparations to return to Earth. Secretly, he was checking possible routes, plotting a course, exploring options for how they could escape from Lunaria if their contract did not allow it. Everything became clear. There was only one way Earth. Now, all that remained was to convince Elani. Her reaction to this plan was key to him. He knew that she, too, felt the end of their journey on the ship approaching. Every time they met, her eyes betrayed the same anxiety as his: how to preserve what has arisen between them and where to go next. And Grayson was sure that Elani was looking for a way out, too. A few more days passed, and the ship was already approaching Lunaria. Inside, Grayson felt an oppressive sense of impending denouement. He had to act quickly. They met on one of the last days aboard Stellar Dawn, saw the same willingness in her eyes that he had. She understood everything without words. Their connection was so deep that no explanation was needed. Elani knew that Grayson was going to offer her something important. That day, the two of them sat in the darkness of one of the ship's technical compartments, where they spent many such evenings. Their silence was more eloquent than any words. They both understood that their romance on Stellar Dawn had come to a point where a decision had to be made. Elani looked at him, and there was so much trust and understanding in her gaze that Grayson felt that they were ready for this step. How they would get back together, how Elani would discover a world so far from her home planet. How would they live together, away from all the rules and restrictions that separated them on board the ship. Grayson knew that Earth was not just his home, but also a place where they could be truly happy. They could be free there. And so, when the ship finally reached Lunaria, Grayson was ready for the last step. Everything was prepared. They were supposed to leave the ship, but instead of staying on the planet, they decided to return to Earth. This decision was made silently, without unnecessary discussion, but both knew that this was their only chance. The plan was risky, but Grayson was confident that they would be able to do everything quickly and unnoticeably. He checked all possible escape routes from Lunaria, found a vehicle that could take them back to Earth. This plan seemed audacious to him, but the only possible one. Elani, for her part, was also ready for this step. She felt that her future was tied to Grayson, and that their bond was more important than any other mission. Her eyes no longer betrayed doubt, only determination. They both knew that this step was the beginning of a new life. As they left Stellar Dawn and headed for their transport ship, which was supposed to take them to Earth, Grayson felt the tension release. Everything he had planned had finally become a reality. Their journey to a new life was beginning. The flight back to Earth was long but calm. They left behind everything related to their secret affair aboard Stellar Dawn. Now a new life lay before them, full of uncertainty, but also of hope. Grayson and Elani were together, and that was the main thing. Everything that had happened up to that moment, their meetings in the secret corners of the ship, moments of intimacy and risk, were now left behind like distant memories. They were flying to a new life. The Earth greeted them with warmth and light. It was another planet, another reality. Grayson felt like he was back home, but this house was different now. Elani was by his side, and their lives were starting from scratch. Returning to Earth was something akin to a new birth for Grayson and Elani. The expanses of space that once surrounded them had been left far behind. Their long journey aboard Stellar Dawn, their secret romance in the dark corners of the ship, the tension of every day spent in the shadows, all this became part of the past, memories that could now be cherished with tenderness, but left behind. The Earth greeted them not with the disturbing vibrations of a spaceship or bright stars on a black background, but with the soft, living light of the sun and the warm colors of the world that Grayson had long called home. For Elani, Earth was something completely new. The planet seemed to her both vast and cozy, like one huge living being full of life and movement. The landscapes that opened up in front of her were completely alien to her ideas about nature. She grew up on Lyrax, a planet with smooth white plains and majestic iridescent oceans. But the Earth struck her with its diversity: green forests, mountains with snow-capped peaks, endless deserts, and blue oceans that hugged continents. Everything was different here, but Grayson became her guiding thread in this new world. They decided to settle on a small farm far from the hustle and bustle of the cities. Grayson, who has always been drawn to silence, found an abandoned estate in the countryside, surrounded by forests and hills. He knew that this place would be the perfect refuge for both of them, a secluded corner where they could start their new lives. The house, surrounded by fields and dense trees, was old, but that was what attracted Grayson. It had a story that could now intertwine with their Elani, with her unusual sensitivity to life and nature, immediately felt the special atmosphere of this place. She often spent time outside among the trees, studying every leaf, every blade of grass, as if absorbing all this new reality. Her luminous eyes, accustomed to the cold luminaries of distant stars, now looked at the Earth with curiosity and surprise. Her hands, which once only touched medical devices and patients on the ship, could now touch living Earth, plants, and water. Life on Earth began to slowly but surely fit into their daily routine. Grayson was engaged in the restoration of the house, repairing old buildings and overseeing the fields that now belonged to them. He spent long hours working with tools, sometimes noticing Elani sitting on the porch or in the shade of the trees, watching him with a slight smile. They didn't talk much, but it wasn't necessary. Now that their lives were completely their own, they no longer had to hide, steal time, or look for secluded places to meet. Everything they wanted was at their fingertips, and that was silence, freedom, and a sense of belonging to each other. Several months have passed since their return to Earth, and gradually the idea came that their union should be celebrated somehow. Although it was something natural for them, they already felt like a whole. Grayson knew that a formal wedding on Earth would be a symbol of their new life. This step was not just following traditions, but also the final confirmation of their decision to be together in this new world. The wedding was an important step for him, which would symbolize the beginning of a new chapter where their love would cease to be a secret and become something open to everyone. The wedding arrangements were simple, as was their new life. They didn't want big celebrations, lavish ceremonies, or lots of guests. It was enough for them to invite a few close friends, both from Earth and those who once crossed paths with them on board Stellar Dawn. People who knew their story, shared moments of space travel with them, and the few who were aware of their secret romance witnessed their new step in life. The place for the wedding was chosen naturally. It was their home, their estate, where every corner had already become a part of their common world. A small clearing near the house, surrounded by trees, became an ideal place for the ceremony. Summer light filtered through the foliage, creating soft rays that danced on the ground as if welcoming them. Grayson felt that this ceremony not only symbolized their love, but also encapsulated all the moments they had experienced on board the ship. Secret meetings, risks, dangers, and finally, the freedom to be together. Everything seemed perfect on the wedding day. The morning was quiet, and there was not a cloud on the horizon. Grayson woke up early, feeling a little nervous, not fear, but rather anticipation. He looked out the window at their house, at the fields and forests around, realizing that this day would be special for both of them. He saw Elani dressed in a simple but elegant dress that emphasized her unusual beauty, walking slowly to the place of the ceremony. Her silvery skin reflected the sun's rays, and she seemed almost a fantastic creature descended from ancient myths. The ceremony was quiet but filled with deep meaning. Everything was happening slowly, almost in the rhythm of the nature around them. The guests, only a few people, watched them with respect and admiration. At that moment, Grayson felt like everything they had been through had finally come to fruition. Their story, which began in the vast expanses of space, ended here in this small clearing in the simplicity and beauty of the earth. After the ceremony, they were left alone in a clearing surrounded by greenery, listening to the singing of birds and the rustle of the wind. Elani was sitting next to Grayson, her hands entwined with his, and at that moment they both realized that their journey was finally. The cosmos, with its endless stars and emptiness, was left behind. Now their home was here on Earth, in this secluded corner where nature and silence became their best companions. Their life on Earth went on quietly, but fully. Every day was filled with the joy of simple things. Gardening, walking in the woods, watching animals. Elani gradually adapted to earthly conditions, finding joy in exploring a world that was completely alien to her before. Her unusual abilities, developed on Lyrax, helped her quickly settle into a new environment. She not only studied plants and animals, but also began to help Grayson with the management of the farm. They spent every new day together, enjoying the harmony and peace that had once been just a dream for them. Grayson, who had always been focused on work and space, now found joy in a simple life on Earth. He was no longer looking for adventures or new challenges. All he needed was Elani by his side, their home and their future together. A few years passed, and their house turned into a real shelter where everything reminded them of the beginning of their new path. In every detail, in every corner of the house and garden, there was an imprint of their joint work and love. Elani brought something incredibly bright into their lives, something that could not be described in words. Their new life on Earth has become the embodiment of all those dreams that once seemed unattainable. And although they both knew that the world would always be full of new challenges and surprises, now in this corner of the Earth, they have found their true home.